Welcome back to another episode of Dazed and Apologize, the podcast where we help you navigate culture's questions with faith and reason. So today we're going to tackle one of the, if not the most prominent question that atheists and just non-believers, and really, here's what's unique about this question. A lot of believers have this question. This is something that I think all people struggle with, and it is the problem of evil. How could a good God allow so much evil and suffering in the world? That is the question that everybody has to grapple with at some point. And here's really the argument. It's really a basic argument. The argument is, if God allows evil and suffering in this world because he can't stop it, then he might be good, but he's not all powerful because he can't stop it. He's powerless to stop it. Or on the other hand, if God allows evil and suffering and he could stop it, but he doesn't want to, he chooses not to, then he might be all powerful, but he's not good. And so therefore, the conclusion that many draw is that the good, all-powerful God that the Bible talks about, that Christians believe, simply could not exist. Now, sometimes you might hear someone argue that maybe God is able to stop it and he wants to stop it, but he doesn't know it's coming, in which case they question the omniscience or the all-knowing attribute of God. But either way, the conclusion's the same. They say the God of the Bible that you talk about simply cannot exist. And so questions then begin to form. Well, how could a good God allow suffering? How could a good God allow so much evil in the world? And it's really a good question. It's something that you and I and everyone needs to be able to answer. We need to be able to discuss this. Now, there is no really easy answer. So you need to know that. Going into these conversations, approach it with humility, but there are some things you can say. And hopefully as we walk through this podcast, and this is going to be several episodes as we deal with the problem of evil. Now, I need to define a term before we go any further. The term theodicy. A theodicy is an attempt to explain the ways of God and the ways of man and how they interact, but particularly with the issue of evil. The whole matter of evil and suffering in this world and how it relates to God, his attributes, his sovereignty. How do we reconcile an all good, all powerful, all knowing God with the presence of evil? That belief or that argument, if you will, is called a theodicy. Now, over the course of history, Christians have wrestled with this question. And they've come up with different theodicies. They've had different beliefs and different answers to the question of how could God allow so much suffering, or how is there so much evil in this world? Now, keep in mind, this is a brief undertaking of these theodicies. We're gonna briefly discuss some of the things that Christians have thought throughout Christian history, and they're all nuanced. There's subcategories of each of these. They all overlap in some ways, and there's much, much more to be said about each of them. This is just a brief overview to get you to understand a little bit about them. And they're not necessarily in chronological order. But first, we're going to look at what Thomas Aquinas, who was an Italian Dominican friar, we've mentioned him before in previous podcasts. Well, he argued that there really is no such thing as evil. Evil is merely the absence of good. And this absence, Aquinas called it, was a privation. And he says that evil in the world is really due to privations, the absence of some good or something that ought to be there. Something that should be there. And he really argued that there's three types of privations. The first one, metaphysical evil privation. And that was not really relevant for our discussion, but it's basically described as the shortcomings of things in this world simply by the nature of them being finite. So man is limited in our strength. I can't pick up a 10,000 pound rock. We're limited in our knowledge. Dogs fight each other. There's all kinds of, you lay things that are in existence against what they ought to be and how they should function and the good that ought to be there, and it's not. That's a metaphysical evil privation. But secondly, naturally evil privations. Now these are shortcomings or sufferings that are brought about not by moral choice. So they're not directly tied to a choice that someone makes. These are things like natural disasters, most illnesses, genetic mutations, if you will, things that which no human can be morally responsible. Now, Aquinas says that these things are necessary for the good of the ecosystem. The food chain is an example of this. Grass, which is eaten by the grasshopper, which is eaten by a frog, which is eaten by a snake, which is eaten by a hawk. These are all necessary for the proper functioning of an ecosystem, which is ultimately good for everybody. But what takes place in that is death and decay. A third type of privation that Aquinas talks about is morally evil privation. And this is just what I said earlier, that was not the naturally evil. These are sufferings or privations, absences of good, directly related to a choice that a moral human being makes. So someone lacks honesty, so they tell a lie, and then they suffer, or others suffer because of the lie they told. Someone lacks integrity, and they rob a bank, and they suffer due to the choice that they made, etc., and etc., and etc. So Aquinas uses that to explain the existence of evil and how God has ordered the world. So another theodicy that's out there is that God is responsible for evil and suffering completely. He ordains it, He allows it, He's the source of it, and we just need to accept that He's God, and that's that. He can do whatever He wants because He's God. And who are we to question the ways of God? The third type of theodicy out there is simply that we don't know why. We believe that God is good, and we believe, therefore, that He must have a reason, a morally justifiable reason for allowing and continuing to allow evil and suffering. But because we are finite and He is infinite, we are created, He is the uncreated one, that we really cannot seek to know or fully understand His reasons. So we just have to accept them on faith and live our lives and focus on what we can know and what we can understand and what we can do. We focus on ourselves and we don't worry about those other things. And then a fourth theodicy, which is really the most prominent one out there. And I do want to say, before I dive into this one, there's elements of truth in all of these. I think they're helpful. And I'm not trying to come across like these are all trash and what I'm going to say is going to be, the greatest thing since sliced bread. There's some truth and some good things in all of these. There's some things that we can take. I mean, we are finite and God is infinite and we cannot fully understand His ways and we must live by faith. And the Bible's full of things that we need to obey and we need to focus on those things. And evil is the absence of good. I mean, there are a lot of good things about these. So I'm not trying to knock all of them. Right now, I'm trying to briefly discuss these theodicies in different ways that Christians have dealt with the problem of evil. But the fourth one here, the greater good theodicy. This one's very prominent. Lots of Christians I know believe this. And it was really first crafted by Augustine. Saint Augustine was a philosopher and theologian. He was the bishop of Hippo in North Africa in the mid-4th century. He was really one of the first prominent Christians to tackle the problem of evil, to ask the question. And he argued that God allowed only the evil in the world from which He could bring about a greater good or prevent a worse evil. Okay? So the only evil that's out there is the evil that God allowed because He was going to take that evil and use it to bring about a greater good, or the evil was necessary to prevent a worse evil. Okay, this is what Augustine believed in what he wrote about. Now, I think we've come to realize that the latter part of that is really not sustainable, because if the worst evil never happened, then there's really no way to prove that the evil that came before that prevented it, because it never happened. So really that one has kind of been forgotten, or at least not really taken hold. But the first part of his argument has really taken hold in this world, that God allows evil in order to bring about a greater good. Now this often plays out in your normal conversations like this, like, oh, I have a stomach ache. Oh, my stomach's hurting. I go to the doctor, they do a scan of my stomach and they find stomach cancer. Okay, so someone would say, wow, God allowed the stomach ache, the suffering, the pain, so that the cancer, something worse, could be found out, diagnosed, and treated. I had a friend one time in college, we were playing basketball, he broke his ankle. We went up, he landed, snap, the ankle broke completely in two. We rushed him to the hospital. While he was there, he was able to share the gospel with the nurse. And so he was so excited, saying that God allowed him to break his ankle so that he could share the gospel, so the nurse could hear the good news of the gospel from him. So these are examples. You may have said these or heard these or know of these where the greater good theodicy is utilized to explain the evil that took place. However, I think there are some problems with this. There's certainly some truth to that. I think biblically speaking, we're going to look at some verses where that is something that God can do. But as an explanation for all evil, I think it has some problems. So it begs some questions in my mind, and seminary professors that I've listened to and had classes with, it begs some questions in their mind. First, you got to ask, where is the good? So if you argue that all evil, that every single evil, natural or moral, is allowed by God in order for him to bring about the greater good, then what do we do with evils that have no obvious good that was derived from it? Things where there's not an obvious good that comes. Is it sufficient to say, well, because we can't see it, doesn't mean it's not there? That may be true. We certainly don't have to see everything to know it's real. But is that the best answer? Where is the good? If you can't see it, is that helpful? A second question is, how do we know how much good is required to offset or counterbalance a particular evil? My seminary professor would say, how many units of good must be brought about to counterbalance how many units of evil? He's obviously kind of being tongue-in-cheek there, but it seems to be arbitrary at best. Because the idea of a greater good implies that there's some sort of measurement or judge or rubric or something out there, a scale, in fact, to determine if something is, in fact, greater. So I break my leg and the nurse hears the gospel. Okay, as a believer, I certainly would argue that's a greater good, but what about the non-believer? Are they going to think that's a greater good? Are they going to understand that? Is that going to be helpful to them? How would I explain that to them? So what measurement? How do we determine, and who determines greater good than the evil? It seems arbitrary at best. Third question, who gets the good? So I break my ankle, the nurse hears the gospel, so I suffer, but she gets the good. Okay, again, as a Christian, I might be okay with that because I want her to hear the saving message of the gospel. But again, to an atheist, is that going to be sufficient? Or years ago, there was the story of the little girl at a birthday party that took the knife that was used to cut the cake, and she stabbed her little sister and killed her, stabbed her two older sisters. So if you're gonna argue that God allowed that evil and the suffering to bring about a greater good, well, who gets the good? It can't be the child that died. They're dead. Is it the two that got stabbed? Is it the mom and the dad? Is it the little girl who's now in major trouble for murder? I mean, like, who gets the good? And again, how do we know if that good is enough to counterbalance something that evil or that wicked? So I think the greater good theodicy in some ways is helpful, but we must be careful because it raises some serious questions. Not to mention the theological problems it creates, which I won't take time to go into those in detail, but just ask, if the good that comes from the evil was a necessary good, in other words, God brought about the evil because the good that came about it must be there. It was necessary in God's design. Then God would have been the one that willed the evil. He would have been the cause of the evil so that he could bring about the good. And is that theologically correct? Then you say, well, if the good is not essential to God's creation or his plan, but it was just in his creation and plan, then you got to ask, well, why would God allow it in the first place if it's not essential? You could keep going with that. Again, I'm saying you got to be careful with the greater good theodicy. It's helpful in some ways. And I know people often point to Bible verses such as Romans 8:28. Paul writes, we know for those who love God, all things work together for good for those who are called according to his purpose. Wonderful verse. I believe it with my whole heart. We believe it with our whole heart. But that promise is for believers. God works all things for the good of those who love him and are called according to his purpose. So followers of Christ have a promise that God is working all things for good, even our suffering. But the issue of God and evil as a theodicy, as a philosophical issue, is bigger than that because that issue deals with everybody. Evil touches everybody. Suffering touches everybody. And then, of course, you got verses like 2 Corinthians 12:7 when Paul says, So to keep me from becoming conceited because of the surpassing greatness of the revelations that he had, a thorn was given me in the flesh, a messenger of Satan to harass me and to keep me from being conceited. But this is a description of how God was working in a particular person through his particular struggle, through his particular vision and issue with pride. So again, is that meant to be a theodicy? Are we to derive a theology or a doctrine from that? I don't think so. And so what I wanted to do in today's podcast was just help you understand the problem of evil, the question that is derived. Can God be all good with the existence of suffering? Can God be all powerful with the existence of evil and suffering? And I wanted to briefly look at just some ways that Christians have argued and thought through this throughout history. And again, I'm not saying these are all bad. There's nuggets of truth and some good things, especially the Aquinas one. I think that one is really helpful. It's kind of difficult to read him, so you really have to take some time and to study him. But that one's particularly helpful once you get into the details and the depth of what he's trying to say. I think they all fall a little bit short and they don't help give a full answer to the question. But we're going to stop right here for today's podcast. And in the next episode, we're going to talk about what's called the creation order theodicy. And that is what, in my opinion, is something I learned in seminary and have read a lot about since then. My professors helped me understand this fully. I spent lots of time in their offices talking to them through this. We're going to dive into that and see exactly what it means and how it can be used to reconcile the existence of a loving, good, all-knowing, all-powerful God and the existence of evil and suffering in this world. So I hope you tune in next time. Thanks.